and welcome. I'm Kat, the Director of Public Programs at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. Thank you for coming to this important panel, The Power of a Woman's Vote. Voting, specifically women's voting, has been a topic of debate since the founding of this country. And women's political rights and actions remain critical to our society. And so I thank playwright and advocate Leslie Gable Brett for bringing us together to discuss the history and the continued relevance of this vital topic. This panel is inspired by Gable Brett's play, Woodhull Beecher, which delves... Is it not on? Oh, sorry. I could hear myself. All right. Gable Brett's play, Woodhull Beecher, delves into topics such as women's political and social rights, gender roles and power dynamics. Woodhull Beecher, the play, develops these themes around some well-known 19th century actors such as Isabella Beecher Hooker, Victoria Woodhull, and Henry Ward Beecher. And as our panelists will discuss, the women's suffrage movement was a social movement with many people involved. And these 19th century issues hold remaining consequences and resonances even today. And they hold resonance perhaps especially today in an election year, the day after Super Tuesday, when 17 states and territories held primary presidential elections. And so thank you, Leslie, for bringing us together. Thank you, She Leads Justice, the Heartbeat Ensemble, the League of Women Voters, and the Links for being part of this program. Thank you to the 224 for use of this space, and as well as to Hartford Public Access for recording this evening's program. It is now my privilege to introduce our Lieutenant Governor Bysewicz. A Connecticut native, Lieutenant Governor Bysewicz has a distinguished tenure in office and has worked to ensure women's access to safe medical care, to ensure accountability in government, supporting business developments, and good-paying jobs. She has served with distinction and integrity in the roles of Secretary of the State, State Representative in the Connecticut General Assembly, and this is her second term as Lieutenant Governor. So please welcome Lieutenant Governor Bysewicz.
Well, thank you so much, and what a pleasure to be here with my very favorite leaders and organizations, Madam Secretary and the Secretary of the State's Office, She Leads Justice, the League of Women Voters, the Links. What a group to discuss this very important topic of voting and women's suffrage in Women's History Month. I have to say that we are making progress as women. When I first took office as a member of the General Assembly, there were 25% women. Today, they're 37%. So we're doing a little better, but we have so much more to do. And I wanted to share with you two inspirational women who inspired me to do what I do, and women who have inspired countless other women and men to make progress for our state. So the first is my mom, Shirley Racy Bysewicz. And my mom is shown here in her law office at the University of Connecticut. So my mom was a trailblazer herself. She was born as a child of immigrants in Enfield, and she had a dream that she wanted to go to law school. And the early 1950s was not a time where women were doing that. But because she was the youngest and she had older sisters who supported her in her quest, she was able to graduate from law school in the early 1950s, and she went on to become the first female tenured law professor at the University of Connecticut, where she had the opportunity to help mentor more than a generation of women who are now judges, partners at major law firms, elected officials, and more. And the reason she taught law is because you couldn't get a job at a private law firm. And along the way, she made friends with a special woman who was doing the same thing as her, who couldn't get a job at a big firm despite her academic record, and that was Justice Ginsburg, whom she predicted when I was in college would someday be on the Supreme Court. And I remember saying, "Mom, she's been in our backyard to a picnic. There's no way she's going to be on the Supreme Court, but always listen to your mom because she's right." And I bring her up because she and a group of audacious, fearless women decided to start the Connecticut Women's Educational and Legal Fund, QUELF. Now she leads Justice because it has evolved with the activism and the leadership of so many women across Connecticut. So that was one of my trailblazers and inspiration. And the other that I thought was important to mention is this woman, Ella Grasso, who was a trailblazer and a leader herself. She was elected governor 50 years ago in 1974, the first female in the whole country to be elected governor in her own right. There had been a couple of women who succeeded their husbands because they were term limited. In Lurleen Wallace's case, her husband was term limited, and the other was the governor of Texas, who was convicted of selling pardons, so therefore his wife, Ma Ferguson, became governor of Texas. So Ella Grasso had a huge impact on the state. She inspired so many people, including me, because I met her in high school when I was at a youth in government program, and she literally inspired me to go into politics and public service, along with so many other people who stand on her shoulders. So I think we can celebrate some of the progress that we've made since then, but we have so much more to do. And how can we make that progress? Well, we can make that progress by voting and participating, because in every presidential election since 1980, it's been women participating that have made the difference in the result of the election. And if ever there was an election where women could make a difference, it's this one, when women's rights, civil rights, voting rights, so many rights are at stake. And so that's why this conversation is important. And I just want to mention Reverend Bishop William Barber, who's leading the Poor People's Campaign. And he is getting those women and men who are involved in labor unions involved in getting organized for this election, because so many of our most vulnerable people aren't participating in elections. Why? Because they got 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, and there couldn't be a more important reason for them to participate. And I mention Reverend Barber because the final point I want to make is that one of the reasons we got women's suffrage passed in Connecticut was because of the labor union movement. It was the textile workers in Eastern Connecticut, many of whom were women, who were advocating for women's suffrage from Thompson and Putnam and Plainfield and Killingly and Wyndham. Literally, there were rallies, car rallies, that would start at one factory and go to the next because labor organizers had an epiphany that they would be more powerful if their workers, many of whom are women, could participate. So you have a lot to talk about, some fabulous panelists to help lead you through this, and I want to say thank you to the organizers, because this is such an important conversation, and it's nice to be in the company of fabulous, powerful, competent women and some men of taste and discernment. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, and I love that you brought props. Well, thank you so much. I'm Janae Woods-Weber. I am the Executive Director of She Leads Justice, formerly known as Connecticut Women's Education and Legal Fund. We're so excited to host you here tonight at the 224 for this really exciting conversation about the power of a woman's vote. But first, a few housekeeping details. Please make sure you are parked in the correct spot in our parking lot, and in particular, if you own a Jeep Compass, a white four-wheel drive, this car is parked in the wrong area, and I suggest you make haste to move it because you might be towed. So please, if that is your car, no one in here? Okay, we're all good then. Also would like to point out that there are restrooms behind this space if you go out into the hallway to the left. And we're joined tonight by a wonderful panel of very distinguished academics and practitioners in the area of voting rights and women's suffrage, civic engagement here in the state of Connecticut. I'd first like to introduce Dr. Deborah Dukoff-Barone, immediately to my right. Debbie is the co-president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Hartford. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. Debbie received a BA from Bard College and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, all in American Studies. And she also holds 5 certificates in organizational management and leadership, and her diverse career spans nonprofit and corporate sectors as well as public service. Thank you so much for being here, Debbie. Dr. Walton Brown Foster, PhD, is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Central Connecticut State University, where she is a coordinating faculty member of the African American Studies program. She is editor-in-chief of the online journal 1619, Journal of African American Studies. She received her doctorate in political science from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and her areas of research and teaching are Latin American politics, African politics, international relations, comparative politics, religion and politics, and African American race and ethnic politics. Her most recent publication is an article on African American women and the 2020 US elections. Dr. Brown Foster is a lifetime member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and is currently the president of the Greater Hartford chapter of the Lynx Incorporated. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Walton. And our third esteemed panelist is Secretary of the State of Connecticut, Stephanie Thomas. Stephanie Thomas has spent her entire career in public service. Prior to her election as Secretary of the State in 2023, she served as State Representative of Connecticut's 143rd District, Norwalk, Wilton, and Westport. As Vice Chair of the Government Administration and Elections Committee, Secretary Thomas sponsored and helped pass a variety of voter-focused bills, such as automatic voter registration and resolutions to advance early voting and universal access to absentee ballots. Secretary Thomas is committed to protecting voting rights and strengthening civic education in Connecticut. Thank you so much for being here, Secretary Thomas. So, it is clear that we have some incredibly brilliant and distinguished women here at the stage ready to share their knowledge with us. So, shall we get into it? I think it would be helpful if we first set the stage a little bit. Debbie, would you like to give us a brief introduction to women's suffrage? Yeah. Thank you.
Is this on? Yes. Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'd like to thank Kat and you, Janae, for organizing this. My partner, Walton, who I hooked into this over Panera a couple months ago, and of course, the Secretary of State. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedule. I want to share with you my suffrage story in getting ready for this evening. I'm going to talk and read a little. It's not long. Years ago, when I was an undergraduate at Bard College, I completed a women's studies course that included sections on how women won the vote. Attended by the origin story of the suffrage movement that I studied began with the now famous 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. Attended by over 300 women and men and led by prominent suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, the convention stands as the beginning of the broader women's movement, feminist movement in this country. But long before Seneca Falls, women voiced concern over their lack of participation in our democracy. As early as 1776, Abigail Adams told her husband John that women threatened fomenting a rebellion because they had neither a voice nor representation in the making of the laws by which they were bound. 36 years later, New Jersey granted property white women the vote, and prior to ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, giving women access to the ballot, they voted in some form in all but 8 states. By 1893, Connecticut women could vote on school issues. 1909 legislation would have given them a say in library matters, but its implementation was held back by the state's strong conservative Republican machine. Opposition to women's suffrage by Connecticut's Republicans resulted in the state's failure to take its place in history as the 36th and final state to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920. It was news to me that when granted the vote, many women did not take advantage of it. Only 20% of eligible Connecticut women voters exercised their franchise in 1920. Women in the United States did not vote in large numbers, partly because the 19th Amendment gave them access to the ballot, but it did not guarantee they could actually vote when they got to the polls. The 15th Amendment granted access regardless of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. The 19th Amendment, modeled after the 15th, likewise granted access to the ballot regardless of sex. However, eligibility to vote was left to the states. During the post-1920 era, many states limited eligibility by putting in place voting requirements such as poll taxes. My knowledge of these requirements was confined to southern states, but I learned that Connecticut's mandate of a residency requirement and a literacy test expanded my view to include an example of a northern state that too issued eligibility requirements. So women can get to the polls, but were they eligible? That was a whole other question. Where they were instituted, these eligibility requirements ultimately barred significant numbers of voters from the polls, especially African American women and men. For me, learning about the suffrage journey of Black women in particular represented the capstone of my preparation for this panel. At Bard, the journeys of upper and middle class white women dominated the suffrage stories I was exposed to. But their organized efforts set in motion decades of feminist activity in this country. Although it's not my intention to diminish their contribution, it is the compelling histories of African American women that led me to appreciate the multi-layered complexity of the full suffrage story. And it is complex. Scholarship generated for the 2020 centennial of the 19th Amendment emphasized to me how the stories of white women's suffragists intersected with critical issues of race and gender. The stories of African American women involved in the movement reveal this intersectionality, and their stories are key to understanding suffrage. In 1869, suffragists faced a controversial challenge over race and gender when, at a convention of the American Equal Rights Association, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton refused to support the 15th Amendment because it omitted sex. They declared white women deserved the vote before black men. The conference devolved into chaos over this issue, and the suffrage movement split into the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Anthony and Stanton, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone, who favored the 15th. The rift between the two organizations lasted until their merger in 1890 with the founding of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This split really set back the suffrage movement for years. The 1896 split irrevocably dismissed African American women from the entire suffrage movement, even though they attempted collaboration with each of the suffrage groups. Their marginalization from mainstream suffrage efforts continued into the 20th century. At the highly publicized 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., African American women were asked to march in the back of the procession. Ida B. Wells, the well-known African American suffragist and anti-lynching campaign leader, defied the request, taking a place with her white cohort from her state, Illinois. Wells' defiance demonstrates the strong perseverance African American women displayed during the suffrage movement. She was only one among many African American women who fought for suffrage through leadership in community clubs, federated organizations, and churches. These are not the typical outlets that I learned when I went to Bard. Locally, the story of Hartford's Mary Seymour Townsend is notable. She was a political and social visionary whose activism on behalf of African American workers, again, the union thread comes in, laid the foundation for Black union organizing and civil rights activity in Hartford. Between 1917 and 1920, she devoted her energy to advocating for suffrage, despite her exclusion from the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, which was founded in 1869 and which boasted membership of around 32,000 by 1917. In 1919, a nationwide train tour known as the Suffrage Prison Special stopped in Hartford, attracting much publicity and fanfare. Mary Seymour Townsend joined the crowd at the event, and as did other African American women. However, local newspaper coverage only printed names of the white suffragists in attendance. Townsend also showed up at a luncheon commemorating the Hartford stop and collected donations for the suffrage cause. She remarked that her actions were a sign of inclusion without compromise. She also ran for Secretary of State in 1922 and was the first African American woman to do so, and I think you're aware of that, Secretary.
It only took 100 years.
Right. She also ran on the labor ticket for a seat in the General Assembly, did not win, but again, another valiant effort. That Mary took the high road here is a mark of her integrity in what must have been a very difficult situation for her. And I'll close by saying I was heartened by Wells and Townsend's courage. Within the context of what for me is a significant rebuilding of the suffrage story, their legacies, as well as those of all the African Americans committed to suffrage, begs the following question. Was ratification of the 19th Amendment a milestone for democracy, given the previously overlooked intersection of race and gender as critical factors in the suffrage story? I leave it to the panel to ponder this question. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Debbie. That was an education. Thank you so much for that brief but incredibly comprehensive overview of the history of the suffrage movement. You said so many wonderful things. I hope I can get a copy of those notes later so I can read over them again. But I was really struck when you talked about the multi-layered complexity of the full suffrage story. Because we tend to think of the suffrage movement as something that only exists in the past. But we're here today still talking about so many of the same intersectional issues. So I'm curious to hear first from you, and then maybe Walton, you can chime in here. In your opinion, what is the legacy of the suffrage movement? And what are some key takeaways for today, understanding, of course, that there were so many moments during the suffrage movement that stand out, and you highlighted a few of them here, but for you in particular, what of those moments do you think have particular resonance or influence today?
I call them defining moments.
Please use your microphone.
Sorry. Yep. I'll forget. I call those defining moments, and there's a lot of those in the history of women's suffrage. I do think that the Seneca Falls passed a legacy on to women, because what's overlooked about the convention at Seneca Falls in 1848 was not only that they advocated for women's voting, but they had a whole declaration of sentiments, which was based on the Declaration of Independence, and it outlined women's grievances with men. Right to property, right to vote, right to education, right to the profession. And that call for gender equity is a thread that has followed through all the years since. So I call the Declaration of Sentiments a defining moment. And for me, the other one I alluded to, I mentioned in my talk, was the split in suffrage. That's a defining moment, because that really raises intersectionality of race and gender in a way that I think should be eye-opening for people. It's been overlooked significantly in the story of white, prominent, upper middle class suffragists, and it really opened my mind to how many layers of suffrage there were. For me, that was a legacy, and that legacy of that split, even though the groups have come together, I think there's still a lot of work to be done in that coalescing of groups towards a women's movement, a successful women's movement.
Thank you, Debbie. Walton?
Hello. So before I begin, thank you for the organizers and my panel neighbors and friends and you, the audience. And I am very appreciative for the invitation and make new friends, but keep the old. And so I have been really privileged over these past few months in meeting new friends and sharing ideas and information. I want to start with numbers, because the takeaway from the history of suffrage, at least from the perspective of African American and indigenous women, begins at another starting point. And for African American women in particular, we have to begin with 1619. So you're talking about a movement, a struggle that took place to date over 405 years. And within that 405 years, from 1619 to 1865, do the math, that is another several hundreds of years before African American women were actually viewed as being people and viewed as being women. And many of you hear that resonated in Sojourner Truth's famous statement, "Ain't I a woman?" So African American women's contribution to the whole experience, and I would also include indigenous women, is the humanization of women, period. And also a journey from being property to making property to becoming full human beings. And then being deterred by the other element and strain of race, which I'm, in the next section, will share with you a particular perspective that I don't think many people think about, but that's a teaser. From 1865 until 1920, women, African American women, not only deterred by race, were once again rejected by the 19th Amendment. And from 1920 until from 1877 until 1965, the structure of Jim Crow, which Debbie did properly set up, which was not limited to the South. Many people want to just isolate the South, but Connecticut has a long, storied history of structured Jim Crow, not called Jim Crow, de facto as well as de jure. 1965, so do the math, for 1619, 1965, the constraint of race. Not benefiting, it takes another 88 some years from 1920 until 1965, 68, before the election of the first African American woman to Congress. And you all know who she was, I think, right? Shirley. People think of Shirley Chisholm, but the woman who actually preceded Shirley Chisholm was Fannie Lou Hamer, who ran in Mississippi for the U.S. Senate, but of course was deterred. I was asked, and I think a part of the question what were some of the key milestones, to constrict 400 and some years to a few milestones, it's very difficult, but I did try. So I like to think of the first key milestone being 1833. Sojourner Truth is remembered as the first African American woman to speak and make a stance, a suffragist and abolitionist, but it was actually Maria Stewart in 1833 who was the first and is on record historically recognized as the first African American woman to make a political speech. She did so on February 27th, 1833 in Boston, in which she drew the line and made the first public stance. And we are so accustomed to speaking freely before crowds, but in 1833, for an African American woman who legally had no rights, who nationally may not have been viewed as being human, and in some quarters viewed as property, but to speak publicly before a mixed male-female and interracial crowd, that was huge. That was a milestone. Most African American women who could speak from 1619 to 1833 were unheard, silenced, seen maybe, but not viewed, but not seen. And so that was a huge historic moment. And for me, from 1833, Mariah Stewart to the election of Shirley Chisholm is really the time frame where we see the most significant strides and contributions of African American women, not only in the struggle for women's rights, but racial equality and human rights, because it was the non-majority women that had to strive even further to make a stance make a stand when it came to our common humanity. And what we know today as human rights, in my opinion, would not have been possible without that legacy. We have, and some of the milestones Debbie's already spoken about, but I want to mention December 6, 1865, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. A struggle, a milestone, but for African American women, a nothing burger in many ways. But there is a little twist that I'll talk about, a part of my teaser, that comes out of that later. But when we think of it, freedom really meant a continuation of another type of bondage for African American women, being free, the end of enslavement, but where did it lead them? Okay, the 15th Amendment excluding them as well. 1890 to 1920, this is where we saw the active exclusion by suffragists that Debbie spoke about from the movement. In fact, when you look at some of the statements of Susan B. Anthony, African American women were considered to be inarticulate, inferior intellectually, just not publicly acceptable, and therefore excluded. And then they made another stance, and that was the issue of race had nothing to do with white women, which we will find out it does. 1913, Ida B. Wells, very special to my heart. She and 22 young women from Howard University established my sorority, Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and they were the 22 young women that made that brave move to march in the suffragist movement, even though they were discriminated against. And I also have to give a shout out to one of the founders of, or one of the members of our other major sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha, Nellie Ponder, who was the dean at the time, I believe, that released the 22 young women to march in that campaign. To little consequence, because it took another 88 years before African American women could actually vote. So I will stop there with those key highlights as I got the signal to wrap it up, but I will get back, I promise.
Well, you did promise us a teaser, so we're definitely going to come back to you. But professors, as I think about,
Can I say something?
yes,
I'm not a professor, and I'm very honored to be here, the only panelist without a PhD.
I don't have a PhD either.
But I have learned so much, and I've been scribbling notes. And as someone whose job it is, I'm tasked with the civic literacy of the residents of Connecticut. When I heard you ask about like what the resonance is of the suffrage movement, what I heard today from Kat, Debbie, no. I didn't write a note when you were talking, but the history is fascinating. But Kat said, a social movement with many people involved. And what I am always struck with is you can't achieve big things with minimal effort. And I feel like we have entered an era in society where everything is supposed to be easy. And, you know, I think about also, Debbie mentioned all this time, and you cannot make a big social culture shift by one, not involving everybody, and two, it takes a lot of time. And when I go out and talk to young people about civics, it feels a little lost on them. Everything is supposed to be easy and quick. And it just struck me that like these are lessons we all need to learn, because even when everything is going right, it can take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And it moves faster if we all get on the same page and push in the same direction. Sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, no, you did not interrupt. That was a perfect comment to bring us to the next part of our conversation.
Let me just say, you know, I think it's ironic, thank you for those comments. I think it's ironic that some of the early suffragists were abolitionists, yet when you know, there's a thread there, these were abolitionist women who became suffragists, yet when it came time to broaden their view of what suffrage really meant, they believed in the abolition of slavery, but they did not necessarily believe that black men and women should vote.
Well, I think that that is a part of the complexity of political issues and definitions, and also goals. There were many abolitionists who, so to be an abolitionist, there was opposition to the institution of slavery. But that didn't necessarily mean an acceptance of racial equality or racial inclusion. The two don't necessarily lead to one another. And there's another thing that I want to, we often, when we think about women and how is it that women who supported abolition, who supported suffrage could have these very contradictory views when it came to race. And this is where I, as a political scientist, have to remind people that when we talk about political socialization, which answers why, even in 1920, why women, white women who were given the right to vote very rarely voted, it has to do with what we political scientists study, and that's socialization. You can open the door, but if you are being socialized and taught not to go through that door, you will continue to not go through that door, which really does create a real contrast when it comes to African American women who, from 1619 until 1965, not only knew that they wanted to had to create a door, open the door, but also had been socialized to go through that door. So there wasn't a big lag of time between the Voting Rights Act and Fannie Lou Hamer running for office because of those very different experiences and socialization routes. And when we talk about movements, social movements, political movements, they're very complex phenomena with very, very concrete, but sometimes very subtle moving parts, and very difficult to study. And we very often have progress, setback, progress, setback. But it is momentum nonetheless. And I think that's why that expectation that things just happen overnight kind of misses the point. It has to do with the way that we're being socialized, but also the difficulty in studying movements, change and transition to begin with.
Well, I think that is a really thought-provoking statement, and it makes me want to ask you a big question. We're talking about movements. I appreciate that we have had meaningful conversation about the ways in which race and gender were pitted against each other in the women's suffrage movement. And of course, now we're sitting here in 2024 and it's Women's History Month. So I'm curious, as a political scientist, as a professor, as an elected official, Secretary of State, how do you view the intersection of the historical fight for women's voting rights and the modern movement for intersectional feminism, which has racial justice at its core? How do you view that, especially in a post-Roe world and at a time when income and wealth gaps still impact women of all backgrounds, but especially women of color?
So this is the answer to my teaser. Or this is my teaser revealed. And this is why it's so important to include and have an inclusive history of the foundation of this country. Because there is a big piece of history that answers that question from the very start. And it happens in 1662. And I will quote, this is after the period in Virginia called Bacon's Rebellion, in which there were active efforts to separate white indentured servants from African or black indentured servants, and which brings in the labor movement, to separate. And this is the beginnings of the racialization of slavery in the United States, which makes American institution of slavery so distinct from a system that existed in Europe historically, the continent of Africa, and Asia. So America did not invent slavery, but it created a peculiar slavery because it was an inherited racialized slavery. And it starts in Virginia in 1662, and it changes, and it spreads throughout the country. And I quote, this law was passed, Negro women's children to serve according to the condition of the mother. This was historic because for the first time in English history, you had a matrilineal descendancy, right? Matrilineal descendancy, 1662. And if you were enslaved or indentured, it also ended indentured servitude to slavery. And if you were an enslaved black woman, your children would by birth be slaves and descendant forever, in perpetuity. If you were a white woman, and there was a lot of interracial marriage and miscegnation in all of the colonies during the colonial era, including Connecticut, if you were a white woman with black children, your children would be black, but they would be free, but they would have very minimal rights. And of those rights that would be excluded for both enslaved children and descendants, and those of who were free but black, were, for example, you would not have the right to inherit. You would not have the right to accumulate property. If you had a white father who wanted to make you a beneficiary, if his child was black, he could not pass on property to his children. If you were an enslaved woman, enslaved man, you were property. You could not accumulate property, and you could not pass it down. 400 years of that, or because even after the end of slavery, you had restrictions when it came to ownership of land, accumulation of property, work. And so when you have that combination of gender determining the condition of children, and then the prohibitions to wealth accumulation, you have, and I'm going to kind of borrow Ibrahim Kindi's title, stamped from the start, racial inequality, not only in terms of politics, civil rights, but also economic rights. And that combination and that intertwining of race and gender and suffrage begins for African American women in 1662. Some of those same rights were refused white women, and on the books and the laws of the different states as well, mistreated white women in terms of property, so on and so forth. But there were some escape gaps, and there were different outcomes. So from the very beginning, we have this historic model for the intertwining of race, gender, and inequality, and exclusion and marginalization. It just didn't happen overnight. I know that there's a big push against quote-unquote critical race theory, but this is actually what that legal analytical approach does, is to demonstrate the long history of structures that have over the years kind of gone underground because they're so fundamental now we don't even think in terms of how did this all start. And it really did start stamped from the start between the Virginia colony to the American Revolution, and it just continued. The matrilineal descendancy and racial enslavement changes over time from a system in which race and condition are not only determined by the mother, but fathers, the one-drop rule in terms of defining race. And there's a great study done by a brilliant African-American scholar, legal scholar, Pauli Murray, who wrote a book that documents for all of the 50 states this legal structure of race and color that also determined property rights, education rights, and all rights that we claim are very important to American citizenship. So
Thank
that
you.
was my teaser.
Thank you, Walton. I really appreciate the way that you illuminated the history that created the structure that we are now living in, that we're now talking about in terms of trying to expand voter access, in terms of trying to ensure that all people, women in particular, are able to exercise their rights and make it to the polls. And I'm curious, after we've learned about this history, in particular, I'd love to hear from you, Secretary Thomas. We've just spent some very excellent minutes thinking about the history of how we got here, but let's look forward for a moment. In your opinion, how do you think the cultural and political landscape can be influenced by the power of women's votes, especially votes of women of color, especially Black women, in the next few election cycles and beyond, both locally and federally?
How much time do we have? Yeah, interesting. This is so interesting. I so enjoy hearing from you, Walton. So when I think about women, we are the workers. I've only been involved in the political landscape for about 5 years, and 99.9% of the people I see at every event, volunteering everywhere, staffing the tables at events, it's always female, always, anywhere in the state. And I suspect that is true around the country. When I look at turnout numbers and who's influencing elections, there's always women in there somewhere, like one way or another. So I always ask myself, what are our goals? We are already more than halfway there. Why, when Lieutenant Governor Bysowicz said it was 25%, now it's 37% in the General Assembly, that's it? Why? Last year I did an analysis of how many female lawyers, because guess what, lawyers are the only people who become judges. How many female CEOs, how many female, I went through all these criteria, so I can only assume we are doing it to ourselves. And I have been rabid about civic education, and I see voting rights they're very important because, as you said, sometimes laws are passed, but the eligibility isn't there. But it's more than that because, as I like to say when I speak to groups, we somehow, since suffrage, have come to think that voting is like magic and somehow things will work out after you vote. Our country has never been that way. It will never be that way. But we now lack the follow-up. 30% of us vote locally, 80% presidentially, 50% in statewide elections, so that's already bad. But then we step back and we're good. And so for me, I ask women, what are our goals? How are we gonna get there? What's the elbow grease? How are we bringing more people into the loop? And are we fighting for what I think is the core need behind all of this? Because you don't shift a culture if more and more people think their voice doesn't matter. And they think that because there's no civic education. And to me, that is the fight of this century. It's why I ran for office, because until we convince people once again that our voice does matter and that it's worth going out and fighting that fight, will be lagging behind. And, that is my question to all, I say it to men too, but it's women here today. Like, are we doing it to ourselves? We have the numbers, we have the know-how, we have the people who are already out doing the work. So what are we all gonna do?
I love that question. Yes, please, Walton.
So I have a second teaser. First of all, women are 50 plus 1 and more percent of the population. And when we think about citizenship, how do we get our citizenship? Well, the 15th Amendment gave citizenship, but what kind of citizenship? Birthright citizenship. And as far as I know, historically, up until this point still, the most important actor in the birthrights and the fundamental birth of citizens would be women. And so in many ways, it's right there staring in our faces in terms of what an important role women play in citizenship, which is a cornerstone of democracy and belonging. But as a political scientist, and we know, and you are actually witnessing what we study, and that is that democracy isn't only about voting. And the one thing that women have learned from 1619 and beyond is that there are other ways of participating besides voting. And voting is not enough. Our goal, the goal of suffrage was to get the right to vote, but perhaps there needed to be more than that. And I think that is the lesson that African American and the history of African American and non-white women, but I think for majority women also, if they take a proper view, step back, of even history in general, it has always required more. It has always been about more. Why do you want the right to vote? Well, to participate. Why do you want to participate? To make decisions, for representation. And while we achieve one goal, perhaps the struggle is so tiring that once we achieve it, it's like we need a breath. I don't know. It's very complex, but it is a movement. It is a process that has to continue, and the supports have to be there.
I have to say one more thing because it is tiring, but Janae mentioned post-Roe, and to me that is a perfect example of what we're talking about. I do think there's this belief somehow that his laws maybe are static, right? Instead of on a constant continuum. Because I hear people say, oh, we passed a law about that. And I'm like, well, you could pass a law against it, like tomorrow. And there doesn't really seem to be an understanding about that, or because again, civic education, no one knows how laws are made and how the process works. But when I said earlier, like, what are our goals? I remember maybe it was in between, I guess Obama's second term. My husband said, well, I hope everyone's working, are going to be thinking about, or I guess when they didn't let Garland forward for the Supreme Court, I forget like now, I guess that was the 2016 election. In 2015, my husband was saying, like, every woman should be making sure the next president is going to be someone in favor of abortion rights because that's where the Supreme Court pick is going to come. But we now know from history that most women didn't vote that way. So when I say eyes on the prize, I do feel like a lot of these big movements, civil rights, women's suffrage, etc., people sometimes didn't expect to see change in their lifetime, but they still worked really hard for it. Like, we can't be thinking who's on the ballot in November. We have to be thinking who's on the ballot in November 2040, or whatever it might be. Like, you have to plan ahead, because guess what, it takes a long time to surface a pipeline of candidates who can make it to the highest offices, and it has to be a long game, not a short game. So.
Absolutely.
I want to, so history, there's continuity, and I think that there's continuity and change. And one of the things that I think that Debbie pointed out at the very beginning was that even when we talk about suffrage, we're talking about not a total unity, that there were trade-offs that were made. And the women of the South, the women of different quarters viewed the goals very differently, and we see that still today. And so I think that there is this kind of false expectation that a movement is fully united on all levels. And so in the election of Obama, for example, you found a big crossover in which women really did push for him. But those very same women crossed in the other direction and voted the opposite way. Yes, African American women have been, I guess the expectations are kind of frightening to me. They saved democracy, they're the ones that we have to count on to save it this time, so on and so forth, which, is kind of reinforces a classic historical stereotype, I think. But we cannot assume that achievement of goals and movements will automatically bring unity, because women were just as much affected by the overall culture and cultural changes and transitions and values. We have 50 states, how many municipalities, how many different communities. Women are a part of this. And I remember, we can't forget that not only did Susan B. Anthony and the suffragists have certain racialized views and became very hostile to Frederick Douglass, for example, we also had, and I will never forget, William Jefferson Clinton basically revealing that at one time his mother was a staunch segregationist. And so, to me, it's not surprising, and yet he was able, and she grew along with him, changed, and so this expectation that women all of a sudden understand the connection between race and gender and racial oppression and gender oppression, we assume that oppression is a bad thing and everybody's against it and so on and so forth. But just as men are divided, some for it, some against it, women are too. And so that's socialization. But does that mean that we have to discredit the movement that led to even those kind of attitudes on the part of women being represented? What does that do to our overall democratic movement and process? And one last thing when it comes, and I have to go full-blown political science professor here, and that is our notions of democracy. Democracy is very diverse and it's very nuanced. We have voter repression, but we still consider ourselves to be a democracy, right? We have lack of representation, but we still consider ourselves to be a democracy. Democracy is not, to me, a goal. It is a process, and that process will produce outcomes that for some are very non-democratic. Others would say, well, it was a process. And so we will always have these kind of dilemmas, I think.
So I'm going to bring it back to the personal. This is my story because I told my suffrage story. So, how can I say this? You know, life is a journey, and we're all a product of our upbringing and our environment, and that gets to the bigger issues of socialization and culturalization. I remember growing up in the suburbs of New Jersey. My mother was not an inclusive person. I can remember, I'm a child of integration, and my mother getting out, we walked to school, and my mother would come out the door when a carload of African American men parked their car in our street. My mother came out yelling, "Get back in the house." That's how I grew up. And I think also so you have to, it takes a while to find your voice as a woman, I think. And I think we have to realize that you know, on a personal level, we join movements and we get involved, but it takes a while as a woman in this society to find your voice and speak for your voice and speak your language. And so that brings me to the League of Women Voters, of which I'm passionate about. It took me a long time because I was so busy with my education, so busy paying off my loans, that it took me a long time to find my voice and finally say, what am I passionate about? Well, I'm retired now, so what am I passionate about? I'm passionate about the League of Women Voters. Even though their history is not one of inclusiveness, our mission is to empower voters and defend democracy. And I believe the only way we can do that is to vote, and once you vote is to get involved in your community and make your commitment and become part of a movement. But first you've got to vote. And so it takes a while for women to find their voice, I think, in this day and age. I see it in I have a great niece who's 8 years old. She's more worried about Taylor Swift, so I bought her a biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I'm worried. I'm worried about where she's going and her life is leading her. And the best we can do is, as women, we can mentor, we can influence, and we can have people join the League of Women Voters.
Thank you, Debbie. And just my understanding is Taylor Swift encouraged young women to vote, and I think thousands of young women registered to vote because of Taylor Swift. So Taylor, if you're watching this, but we are coming close to time. But I have one final question that is heavy on my mind at this moment. So oftentimes, especially here in Connecticut, we come to these kind of events, we get educated, we learn more, but sometimes we think that is the work. And it was so clear from what the secretary said, what Walton said, Debbie, what you said, that this is not just where the work ends, there's more to do. So I'm curious to hear from each of you, as the final word for tonight, what do you hope people, especially women, will do with what we have learned tonight? What is the most important call to action right now?
Start, because I give people commands all the time. No, like, honestly, I hope they'll do something, right? What I see is that there's a small group, and I'm speaking to the converted here, who do a lot, and then many who do nothing. I need us all to do something. We are, then people say, Secretary Thomas, what can I do other than vote? I have an answer for that. We are right now in the process of putting together a little thing we call the Power of Civics. And it's a list of about 40 to 50 things that anybody can do. 5-minute things, 5-hour things, 5-year things, detailed local, state, federal. But it's hard to organize and design, so we're still working on it. But if you go to our website, probably by no later than April 1st, it'll be up, civics101.ct.gov. And when I say do something, what I mean is that civics is not an arrival point. It's also lifelong. I was a state representative. I served on boards in my local town. If you ask me, Like, when is the last date I can submit a bill to Congress? I don't know, because I've never worked in Congress and I never studied it. So I know I have work to do, because in this job, I'm like, I want some federal money. And then I was like, oh shoot, I don't even know that process. Like, I really don't. I know all the congressmen and women, but I don't know the process. And that to me is the secret. You need to learn that process so when you're ready to step into it, you have the information. And no one, I mean, so few people know like when the JF deadline is for state bills, what can happen in a short session versus a long session, how long is the session, who are the chairs of what committee, what bills are up this year in Connecticut, how many people came to testify. Like, as much as we all do, we can all do more, and we have to. We have to, and we have to teach and bring along others.
So this is what I worry about immediately, and it's an existential fear, and that is we are in a very new age of information, and unfortunately, the lack of critical assessment and thinking is really confusing a lot of people. And being able to filter through truth and untruth, it's going to take a lot more active thought, investigation, and thinking. And it's going to be a tougher haul in terms of weeding through so much information. And even if you do know all of the processes, deadlines, and the system, but information and informing themselves of facts and being able to discern between alternative facts and facts, and I'm not even talking about truth necessarily. And so this is what I'm really worried about, not only for myself, but for all generations, because it's becoming much easier to, quite frankly, be deceived. And so even with all of our rights and freedoms, being deceived is truly an existential threat, in my opinion. And I don't have an answer for that, but there is a hygiene for that, and that is really thinking critically and understanding sometimes things are right in your face, like birthright citizenship, but anyway, in relation to Dobbs. And so on that, I'll stop.
I'm going to build off what Stephanie and Walton said, but in a very practical way. My feeling is you have to get involved in your community, and that's clear that both of you said. I don't buy the argument that I don't have time. I don't buy that argument. We work, we have jobs, we have children, I understand that. But you really need to get involved, and the way to get involved is to live the process, because that engenders critical thinking, and that makes you want to vote to change things. So you need to live the process a little, and to do that, you need to get involved in your community. My feeling is if you're able and you can find a little bit of time, we can chunk the work up, we can figure it out, so get involved in your community.
Thank you so much.
The Secretary of the State's office have volunteer sign-up forms.
Right over here.
So does the League.
We have join us forms.
Yes, and I would like to, just to give a shout out to the secretary. I chuckled a little bit when you said, well, nobody knows how the bill gets passed, and nobody knows what's going on at the state legislature. And it's true, too many people don't know, and we often are not taught that in schools anymore. And that is why organizations like the League of Women Voters and She Leads Justice are really important, because we help to demystify that process for people so that you can get educated and you can get involved. And in fact, right on our homepage, sheleadsjustice.org, we have a legislative change toolkit that actually talks to people and explains how a bill becomes a law. Tells you how to navigate the website for the Connecticut General Assembly, gives you talking points on how to speak to your legislators about the issues that you care about. We also have a voting guide. So I highly encourage people to check out the resources for the organizations that are here. And I see we have a question.
I don't know if it was in the agenda, time for questions, but I happen to have some nieces that I'm not sure are excited about voting this year for various reasons you can all imagine. What would you say to these nieces? Like, that happens to be nieces and not nephews that I think might not vote. What would you say that they say, well, I'm not excited about the alternatives?
I don't know if it works, but what I say, so most people who say they're not excited, they're thinking about politics, right? And we have to move the narrative away from politics to governance. We are governed in every single thing we do. Whether this building can be built on this piece of land, how many people can sit in this space. I mean, like literally, what kind of car you can drive to get here. Is there a bus that gets you here? Every single aspect of our life is handled and decided by someone who's elected. So I would rather have a say in who's making those decisions, and sometimes I don't have good choices, right? So eventually we have to get so involved that we make sure we like the choices at the table. But in the interim, even a non-vote is a vote because it's a binary system. It's a winner-take-all system. As we learned in 2016 when people were like, oh, I'm just gonna sit this one out. I'm like, not voting is a vote. It allows someone to win. So that's what I tell people.
Let's remember 1968, because Biden's opponent is Nixon on steroids. And I wasn't old enough to vote then, but I know it was 21. Many people were. And look who we ended up with Nixon. So hold your nose, do whatever you have to do, especially in swing states, contact people, let them remember or be informed about 1968.
So your question speaks to me very personally because, oh, I'm in this political science class, like politics, political science, so on and so forth. And so just practically, one of the first things I do is point to those things that affect students personally. Politics and participation is about interest. How are your interests affected by decisions that are made by others? And would you rather be a part of that process or not? And I think that once that approach is made for those individuals who seem disinterested, politics, so the saying politics is, all politics are local, well, I think it starts even more practically, all politics are personal. And if your nieces, for example, have interest, making the connection between somebody else's decision and those things that they're interested in will truly make a difference and might be the aha moment that, oh, gee, I thought it was only my parents.
I have 12 nieces and nephews, and on election day, I text every single one of them and I remind them to vote. But also, I would say, given the environment we're in now, I would remind them what might happen if they don't vote.
Thank you. I think all of these final comments, as we think about women's suffrage and voting rights during Women's History Month, what remains to be true all the time is that the issues we care about, the issues that impact our lives, are always on the ballot, no matter who the candidates are, and no matter whether or not you choose to vote. So we should vote because our lives depend on it. So thank you so much to our fantastic panelists. Thank you for this lively conversation. I know I learned a lot of new things. I took a lot of notes. And as we start to close, I'd also like to give a big shout out and a thank you to Leslie Gable Brett, whose new play, Woodhull Beecher, inspired tonight's panel. Leslie, would you like to share a few words? Sure. Here, let me walk to you. Sure. Well, here, let me give you the microphone.
It's been so much fun to work with my new new and old friends, and Chief Justice Harriet Beecher Stowe Center, now the League of Women Voters at the Leagues. And this panel was fabulous. I mean, I've been to a lot of panels about women in the vote. You guys were so interesting and inspiring. So I do want to say that we came together to celebrate Women's History Month, and there is a play, and I'm delighted to be working with Heartbeat Ensemble, Gachi Simmons, who was here before he went to rehearsal. It's this Friday night and Saturday afternoon matinee. Tickets are available. Rhoda is in the back selling tickets if you'd like to join us. Victoria Woodhull is one of the most radical and strong and fearless and interesting characters in women's history. It's a complicated story that has to do also with the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. And as you know, he's related to Harriet Beecher Stowe and has a long family history here in Connecticut. It's an exciting story, but it's also all about many of the issues that we talk about here today. So it's fun. I'm excited about it. If you'd like to join us, please do. And thank you again to the community partners that are working with us. And this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here. Please enjoy the tables, meet some of the organizations, and thank you once again to our wonderful panelists and also to the Lieutenant Governor. Good night.